live? Oh, there we go. No, we are joining. I see 60 people suddenly appeared. So I'm just going to, if you can confirm in the chat when you can see us. Oh, somebody, Mark, can see us. That's good. Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. We're all good. All right. So here is Ali. He is dying to tell you all about building some exciting widgets, which I believe were requested last time. And he has 34 minutes to mark. So I suspect this one is going to overrun as well. Over to you, Ali. Take her away.
Thanks. I'll do my best not to overrun, but yeah, given that I've got about 30 minutes of video, not going to happen. Anyway, hello, welcome to Building Widgets again. I'm just going to launch straight into the slides and share my screen here. Application window. Sorry about this. So this month, I'm going to be talking about some of the stuff that people asked about last time, and then some other things that I've been doing. So firstly, a small section on loading custom Java resources, which is a partial apology. I'll talk about the vertical segmented control, and then I'm going to have a look at an in-depth look at the RatingBar widget, which I've just added some functionality to, and then talk about the native field and a little bit of return to the beginning. So Herman asked about using a pre-existing image processing Java library to support a widget. Now, there was going to be a full apology here because we didn't manage to do anything towards this. The FFI level functionality is there, but we currently don't support loading of custom Java classes. That's what I had hoped to make some progress on last month, and it's still my top priority for next time. But we have added some syntax in DP8, which is my resources folder. So this enables widgets and libraries to obtain paths to their resources. So I think I did a bit of investigation earlier. I think there is possibly a way to tweak the class loader so that it has additional classes available. More on this next time, and possibly more on this in the intervening period if I get the time to have a look at it. Okay, so moving on to the vertical segmented control. I think it was Greg Miller, I'm sorry if it wasn't Greg Miller, who asked about making the segmented control vertical. So I've got a prepared video here. That people have afterwards.
I've created a simplified version of the segmented control here with just with two fixed square segments labeled 1 and 2. Here's the script. And basically it does the same sorts of things as the segmented control. It divides the width into a fixed number of segments. There's creation of lines and calculation of rectangles. First thing I'm going to do is rename the variables. So instead of t-width and t-segment width, I'm going to change it to t-extent and t-segment extent. And I've got some t-left here that I'm going to change to t-start. making these variables orientation agnostic is going to help just to understand what we're trying to do. So the next thing to do is to add a variable. It's a Boolean variable just to store the value of whether the widget should display as vertical or not. And then we simply go through and find all the places where there's orientation specific stuff and add if statements. So here we just want my height instead of my width. Here we want to switch the order of the coordinates. Change my width to my height to my width. And here we just need to switch the coordinates around again of this rectangle. And again change my height to my width. The final thing here is to add a property for vertical. And let's add a label for the property inspector. And a setter. Which simply sets the value and calls redraw. Oops, that should be metadata. And there you go. We have a vertical version. Applying that principle to the segmented control, here's a look at the diff for that, which I'll put the link to in my slides. Essentially, it's just that principle repeated throughout this code. And let's take a look at that. So here's the normal segmented control. And untick horizontal. And there we have a vertical segmented control.
That's great, yes. Ali, you might want to turn your mic and video back on. There we go.
Okay, so one thing I will say about that is that it's not in DP8, which is so I'll explain this in a slide. Oh, did that work? So the code is there that if you want to include such a thing in your application, you're welcome. The reason it's not in DP8 is that the min widths property, I'm not entirely sure what to call it. So it needs to be renamed probably because it would no longer describe the property correctly. But should we keep the old name around for backwards compatibility? We could bump the version number, but if we had, there's a bit of a sort of rabbit hole of versioning that could be gone down here. We'll sort something out, so hopefully it'll be in DP9. But in the meantime, if you want the code, it's there. So before we move on to the rating bar, does anyone have any questions about that?
I'm just looking to see if anybody did produce any questions, but I'm not seeing any at the moment. Gregory did confirm that it was him that asked. So I think you can probably carry on with your section.
So it's taking a wee bit of time to switch in between the camera and the sharing. Okay, so Android rating bar. This is one of the sort of widget templates that I had last time. So I decided to do a bit of an in-depth bit on adding a property and a message to this. So you can see a screenshot of it there with the rating change message reflecting the value of the rating bar.
In this example, I'm going to show you how you might add some properties and messages to one of the Android native widgets that I showed you how to make last time. So here's the basis of the rating bar widget. All it does is create an instance of the object and use the view for the widget's native layer. So to turn this into a fully fledged widget, it just needs some properties and messages. Here's the script at the moment. This is just the one that was automatically generated. It's got a few tweaks, but nothing serious. So let's check the API of the rating bar to see what things we should add. Here's the API of the class. The most important property here that we should add is the rating property. So we just need to look and see from the API that there's a getRating method and a setRating method. So let's hook these up to a property of the widget. First we have the property declaration. And we'll add metadata. And we'll just use the number editor. Now we want a variable to store the value. And now we want to add the getter and setter and the foreign handlers to hook into. So from the API, we know that the rating variable should be a float, and we just need to know the code for floats in Java binding strings. So let's look up JNI type codes. Here's the type signature mapping. So for float, we just want F. So let's create the foreign handlers. And the full class name is android.widget.RatingBar. We want the getRating method, which returns a float. We also want to run this always on the UI thread, because this is a UI object, and the local reference to it will only exist on the UI thread. Similarly, add a set rating handler. Okay, and that needs to take a value parameter. So this time the float is a parameter and it returns void. And we also want to run that on the UI thread. Now we set up the actual LCB handlers. First of all, if we don't have a native object, then we're not on Android. So we just want to return the value in the private variable. Otherwise, we want to call the foreign handler. Now with set rating, we want to put the new value into the variable. and then if the native object isn't nothing, call the foreign handler to set it. Now we add onload and onsave handlers. So that if we set the value of the rating in the IDE, it then gets set on the actual object when we launch the stack on Android. Okay, and then we need to make sure that the rating is applied every time the native object is created. So in fact, we need to change this around slightly so that the private variable gets updated with the real value of the rating bar by calling the native, the foreign handler. Now in our onCreate handler, we want to put 0. Okay, now we've done that, we can just check to see that that's all working in the IDE. So let's change this rating to 5. Now let's add a listener so that we can post a message to LiveCode when the user changes the rating. Looking up the set on RatingBar change listener method here, we just need to know the type of the listener. And it's RatingBar.onRatingBar change listener, so it's an inner class of the RatingBar class. And it has a single handler, a single callback handler on rating changed with 3 parameters and returns void. So we want to set up the foreign handlers with their bindings and add a suitable handler for the callback. So first of all, here's a handler that uses the listener callbacks feature to create a listener object in LiveCode Builder. And this takes an array parameter which specifies the mapping of callback method names to LCB handlers. So it returns the listener object and we use this dollar notation for inner classes. and a special interface call which returns the listener. We also need a handler to add the listener to the rating bar. So this takes the rating bar object and the listener object. Now the method is called setOnRatingBarChangeListener. And it takes a RatingBarChangeListener object. So let's just get to the types again. For Java objects we need L and then the fully qualified class and then a semicolon. So you need this dollar again. And a semicolon. That returns void, and we need to run it on the UI thread. It's taking the view, the rating bar view, as a parameter. And now we just need to add the callback handler. So public handler, let's call it rating changed. And if you recall from the API, it has 3 parameters. Now, for technical reasons, these all need to be of JObject type rather than any of the Java native types. They're primitive types. And it returns nothing. And all we want to do here is post rating changed and another slightly technical thing that is needed is to break the engine threads wait loop. Okay, now we just will add a handler that calls these various things. In fact, we don't need to pass in the bar here, we'll just use the native object. So let's call the foreign handler to create our listener. And we're going to pass in an array where the key is the name of the callback handler from Java, so remember that's onRatingChanged. And the value is the handler that we want to be called. So that will create our listener object, and then we just need to add it, or set it in this case. Okay, finally, we just need to call this. Let's call it path data. So let's recompile this and make a copy, put it on our native widget stack. And add some code. So on rating changed, that's the rating of me. And here's the app with the rating bar. Change it. There you go. Rating changed to 3.5.
That was cool, Ali. So, are you back? Are you there? Here he is. Here he is.
Sorry about that. Any questions?
There were a couple of questions. Let me see. Oh, you got the questions. Yes, it was a question. Colorizing keywords. As you said, we had Atom, Text Strangler, and Sublime Text. So I don't think there's anything here that you haven't already. Oh, Greg Dickerhoof said something about how about length and breadth. I think that was in reference to.
Oh yeah. The trouble is that we just want the one word for the property that determines the bit that's more changeable than the other. So it kind of needs to refer simultaneously to the width and height depending on the orientation. I guess length is pretty good, yeah. Okay, so I'll just crack on then. So this screen share. So moving on to the Android native field, there's a big typo in the first line here, which is the Android native field widget works. Before, when I was writing the slides, it worked exactly as the native control created with mobile control create input or multi-line. And multi-line is just a property of the widget rather than a different control type, which is nice. Some last-minute tinkering on my part caused it to crash in DP8, so I will rectify this as soon as possible. It doesn't invalidate the following slides in principle. So creating it was largely an exercise in just processing the Java code. There would have been a way to instead sort of tweak the Java and call into it, but there are a couple of reasons why that was a bit tricky. So I thought it would be nice to just validate LCB a bit. So I'll show a couple of examples of the Java and C++ and then the corresponding LCB. Once the glue code generation is complete, you won't even have to think about these foreign handle declarations. This is essentially what Mark was talking about earlier. So here's an example of the editable property, the C++ there, which is calling into the Java and returning a value for the get. And this is the equivalent LCB. So you've essentially you've shifted the call to Java to the foreign handlers, and just moved the rest of the stuff into LCB. So it definitely feels more simple to me, especially simpler than working with two languages. And here's how the message worked for the native control. Lots of slightly scary looking stuff, which is to do with calling back into native code from Java. And here's the override of the editor action message. Here's the LCB. So it's quite nice to have this as an LCB handler. I think it's pretty clear what's going on. Obviously, there's the foreign handler section, which is eventually will go away when we have the tooling. And all you're doing there is just adding the editor action to the object. So it's pretty nice, I think. Now there are while I was doing this, a few things occurred to me about making native widgets in general. You want to be able to set all the properties in the IDE so that they're initialized correctly when you deploy. So one thing that you have to do for all these native widgets is to destroy the native layer every time the card is closed and recreate it on opening. Well, that means we need to set all the properties back on it every time. So the init view handler, there's a lot of stuff at the beginning there which creates the view, and then obviously we need to add the listener every time, and that's kind of what that looks like. We need to set the properties as well every time we come back to the card. Now you might have noticed the deliberate mistake in the RatingBar code, where I went back and erased something and put it back in. So the second version there is better. Every time you poll for the rating, you update the rating variable as well. So there doesn't seem to be any reason not to do that. And because the user can change the rating with touches, you need to make sure that getRating calls a native method. But then there's a further deliberate mistake, which is that we need to store that value when we close the card so that the rating persists if we move away from the card and back to it. I've got a little section on tooling here, which Mark's already covered some of this. I just wanted to give you an example of the lccompile FFI Java tool. So it's pretty handy for avoiding these errors in binding strings. Here's a little example of what you would get. So this is, you just look at the text view API and see this method, and then that would get converted by the tool into this code, and then you can just directly call text view to set text size. In the resources folder next to these slides, this isn't true. I will add this file though as soon as I have finished. And there is an example of how to actually run that tool on the command line. So returning to Herman's question, I thought there's a second part to it really. There's two parts. There's the actual loading the Java, which we can't yet do, or we might be able to do, but it's tricky. But the thing you can definitely do right now is use the tool to wrap the actual API that's there. So this is one of the classes that's in that package. It's just got 3 methods. Well, a constructor and 2 methods. So at the top here, this is what the LCB Java file would look like. Just got a constructor and 2 methods, and then this would be the output. So that whole class there is just easily wrapped like that. And then you would call it with this LCB snippet. So it's fairly straightforward. Of course, it is only half the task. The rest is to actually use it on some appropriate data. So I said I was going to look at another way of hooking into the native control. I'm not actually going to do that, partly because we're running out of time a bit here. But essentially, the problem is the same thing. So we've got some code that isn't part of the actual standard library, and we just need to be able to load those classes. And actually, for the LiveCode Android classes, you can do that already. So if anyone is interested, you could have a go at wrapping one of the other native controls, either by translating or by hooking into it. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of what I've got here. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And as before, if you can send questions you have, don't seem to be able to turn the camera on here. If you can send questions you have to support at livecode.com with the subject building widgets, then I'll try and include them in next month's webinar.
That's great, Ali. Yes. I'm not seeing any actual questions here, so I think we ruthlessly cut you off because, as you say, we are running late, and we're going to have Todd up next. So if you've got any more questions for Ali, do go over to the Slack channel and ask them in the general channel there. That would be great. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I will be saying hello again in a couple of minutes when I got Todd Fabrica online.
Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry. I had to turn screen sharing off. That's what I forgot there.
Okay. So
thanks, everyone.
From us, and see you in a moment.
Bye.